Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're mapping out a massive, and I mean absolutely fundamental paradigm shift in strategic thinking. We're going to step into the classroom to really analyze the deep, systemic implications of the 1962 Sino-India conflict. This wasn't just some brief border skirmish. It was a completely underappreciated watershed moment that permanently altered how a nation views its borders, its military, and honestly, its entire place in the world.
Okay, let's dive into this central question. Can geography alone guarantee security? For centuries, people looked at the towering peaks of the Himalayas and considered them this impenetrable natural shield against any northern invaders. The assumption was pretty simple, right? Nature has built this giant wall, so we don't have to. But the 1962 Chinese invasion proved that despite this incredibly imposing geographical reality, there's just no such thing as a purely natural defense. Those northern borders instantly became an active frontier, violently answering our question: no, geography alone absolutely cannot guarantee security.
That brings us to Section 1, the geographic illusion and the reality shock. To really grasp the shockwaves of 1962, we have to look at the mindset that existed right before it happened. Prior to 1962, the assumption wasn't just that the Himalayas were a barrier. Planners genuinely believed a major threat could realistically only come from Pakistan. The Chinese threat? Severely, almost dangerously underestimated. In fact, a majority of writers and planners at the time actually thought defense expenditure was totally unproductive. They literally saw it as a drain on scarce national resources. But man, the reality hit hard. The frontiers were active. Physical, robust military preparation wasn't just an option, it was an absolute necessity. Territorial integrity had to become the primary, completely non-negotiable function of the state. The political fallout from this was just immense. Before the conflict, Prime Minister Nehru was a huge advocate for peaceful coexistence. The policy of Panchsheel had really gained ground, pushing for this unique, cooperative relationship with China. It was all embodied in that famous slogan, Hindi Chini Bye Bye. But 1962 definitively demonstrated that when you're facing an actual, physical military attack, a non-aligned and poorly armed nation simply cannot rely on limited power, its allies, or peaceful diplomatic moves to save it. It just doesn't work. Moving on to Section 2, Pillars of National Transformation.
So, what happens when a national myth is just shattered overnight? Well, once the initial shock passed, the government woke up to a very hard truth. You cannot build defense potential in a matter of weeks or months. It requires a systemic, long-term rebuild. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale and speed of this financial pivot. Before the war, the budget was nominal, but almost immediately, defense expenditure absolutely skyrocketed. We're talking a jump from around 474 crore rupees in 1962-63 to 816 crore rupees the very next year. That near doubling of the budget signaled the absolute end to the debate over whether defense spending was a waste. The nation was finally putting serious, heavy capital behind its security. But that massive influx of capital needed structure. The defeat directly led to the creation of the first ever post-independence 5-year defense plan in 1964. Notice how methodical this approach is. First up, a massive expansion of the army. Second, modernizing the Air Force with new radar and aircraft, plus a phased replacement of overage Navy ships. Third, drastically improving road communications right up near those border areas. And fourth, strengthening the defense production base so they could eventually meet their own requirements for arms and ammunition. It was a total overhaul. And within that first 5-year plan, this specific number was the cornerstone: 825,000. That was the target strength set for building and maintaining this newly envisioned, well-equipped army. It's a huge number, and it was a clear, quantifiable acknowledgement of the sheer manpower required to physically secure those vast, incredibly difficult mountain borders. Section 3, Idealism to Realism. But here's the thing, the transformation wasn't just physical. It wasn't just about throwing money and troops at the problem. It was a profound psychological and philosophical shift in how the nation engaged with the rest of the world. Before 1962, foreign policy was heavily defined by what's called moral politic. This was a highly idealistic Nehruvian concept driven by moral principles, non-alignment, and leading the third world. It deliberately refused to accept the emerging bipolar order of the Cold War. But predictably, this idealistic approach proved absolutely useless in a crisis. When the borders were actually breached, high-minded principles couldn't stop the advance. And this brilliantly illustrates the permanent pivot.
1962 effectively killed that highly idealistic era. The aftermath birthed a much more muscular, realistic nation on the international stage. Relying on peaceful coexistence was out. Hard military power and pragmatism were in. Defense became the non-negotiable priority, guiding a foreign policy that continues to blend realism with its diplomatic efforts even today.
Let's look at Section 4, Modern Border Preparedness.
The lessons written in the snows of the Himalayas back in 1962 didn't just stay in the history books. They actively govern the operational art and tactics used on those very same frontiers today. Historically, the temptation in extreme mountain terrain is to just commit a huge number of troops to hold the ground, right? You fight a battle of attrition, launch counterattacks, and try to regain lost territory. But the modern doctrine has shifted dramatically away from that. Thanks to better infrastructure and mobility, the strategy is now offensive defense. This means actively preparing for quid pro quo or repost operations. Essentially, you launch counteroffensives that force the attacker to recoil and commit their own reserves prematurely. It's a real game changer.
To actually execute this offensive defense, the military needs highly specific tools to bridge the gaps that 1962 exposed. It requires strategic helicopter mobility, think Chinooks and Mi-17s, to move troops rapidly across impossible terrain. It requires agile reserves and special forces, like the Arunachala Scouts, to operate in those sparse areas where infiltrations historically happened. And it requires overcoming terrain limitations by deploying long-range vectors and ultralight howitzers. The whole strategy is to turn that harsh environment into chosen killing grounds, without needing massive, static physical deployments everywhere.
Let's move to Condon and see how this builds into Section 5, the future of deterrence.
Because holding physical ground, that's really only one piece of a 21st century puzzle. Modern conventional defense has to be seamlessly integrated across 5 distinct domains: land, air, space, cyber, and information. Our source explicitly highlights that border states are incredibly prone to being targeted in battles of perception. Adversaries will try to exploit local issues, like infrastructure delays or employment, just to lower public faith in the government. Therefore, modern defense means fighting this information war actively, especially during peacetime, while keeping your formations ready to instantly switch from a cyber conflict to a physical one if things escalate.
All of these complex elements combine into one foundational equation: full-spectrum deterrence. It is not just about having the weapons on hand. It's capability plus readiness plus resolve. Against an adversary that retains doctrinal leeway for launch on warning, your conventional defense must be synergized with a strategic response. And you have to clearly signal that resolve by drawing very explicit red lines positioned well forward. So, the crucial point is this: the legacy of 1962 is a permanent reminder etched right into the strategic mindset. The mountains didn't protect the nation. Only infrastructure, modern doctrine, and full-spectrum deterrence can do that. Security is created by meticulous, realistic preparation, never by geography alone. As you look at the map of the world today, ask yourself, where else are we relying on natural barriers when we should be building real capabilities? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.